At this point, Will, more?
That concludes my report, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I think I'd like to dive directly into the Minnesota Sands multi-site EIS, and the question before this board will be whether the Erickson site or the Michelle and Tracy Erickson 19.11 acre mine is a phased action to the Minnesota Sands multi-site EIS project. And I want to ask Kate France to come up and please background this whole issue for the board. Welcome, Kate.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, my name is Kate France, and I am the Environmental Review Lead for the EQB Staff. I've been asked to cover some basic concepts about environmental review that are applicable in this case, so if you have any questions moving forward, I can answer those for you. So these are the concepts that we'll be talking briefly about. We'll start with the basics about mandatory categories, what phased and connected actions are, as well as how they are the same or different from cumulative potential effects. But I'll also cover a couple of our little bit more obscure inclusions from the rule, including the related actions EIS process, as well as the variance process. But first, a little history of the project. On March 20th, 2013, the EQB found that pursuant to the requests made by Fillmore and Houston County and input received from Winona County, the sites named in the findings were phased actions proposed by Minnesota Sands, Minnesota Proppant, LLC that exceeded the mandatory category for an EIS. Specifically, the order reads, the EQB hereby reassigns the status and responsibilities of responsible government unit for silica sand mines proposed by Minnesota Sands, LLC in Fillmore, Houston, and Winona counties from Fillmore, Houston, or Winona County to the Environmental Quality Board. The findings, conclusions, and order named the 19.11 acre Erickson mine site, among others, as phases of this Minnesota Sands multi-site project to be studied in total. Since that finding, we have received the dissolution of contract that is included in your packets, along with a number of additional communications from other parties, all included in your packets for your reference. The question that has been brought forward today by the county on behalf of Mr. Erickson and the project proposer, Minnesota Sands, and is now before the board, is whether or not you can ascertain if a change has been made to, quote, the person or governmental unit that proposes to undertake or to direct others to undertake the project, which of course is the definition of proposer from the Minnesota rules. Regarding specifically the 19.11 acre Erickson mine site since March of 2013, and thereby determine if the 19.11 acre Erickson mine site is still a phased action of the Minnesota Sands multi-site project. Specifically, pursuant to the definition in Minnesota Rules 4410-0200 subpart 60, phased actions must be proposed by the same entity in the same area and be undertaken over a limited period of time. We'll cover this in just a minute as well. In March of 2013, you found that this was the case. In light of the evidence submitted to date and any comments to be made today, at this time, the question before you is the Erickson site a phased action of the Minnesota Sands multi-site EIS? Approving this resolution would affirm that the Erickson 19.11 acre site is not a phased action and would effectively release them from the multi-site EIS that would be completed by the EQB for the Minnesota Sands project. To reiterate the point made earlier, your decision on this matter does not relieve this project from other environmental review requirements it may be required to complete, nor other potential permitting requirements. Those decisions are not the jurisdiction of this board at this time. To clarify today, sorry, I should have done that forward a little bit. To clarify today, your options are to either adopt the resolution before you, amend and adopt the resolution before you, reject the resolution before you, or not take any action at this time. Okay? So with that, I'd like to cover some of these concepts from environmental review, and if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me at any time. So let's talk first about the mandatory categories. Mandatory categories are defined in Minnesota administrative rules, and they include certain categories for certain types of projects. Of course, the mandatory categories, there are thresholds for EAW categories and for EIS size categories. For a category, this category establishes the threshold for a given for projects, and when a specific project, exceeds that threshold, that EAW or EIS becomes mandatory. The Minnesota administrative rules also establish the RGUs for the project types. When comparing projects to the thresholds, an RGU must include phased actions and connected actions, and for EAWs, construction that's begun in the past 3 years. This is commonly referred to as the 3-year look-back rule. For non-metallic mineral mining facilities, there are a number of thresholds that may apply. The ones that are currently on the books are the 40 or more acre mining to a mean depth of 10 or more feet during the mine's existence. But there's also currently a rule on the books that for sensitive shoreline areas as well as non-sensitive shoreline areas. And there are similar EIS thresholds for those types of situations as well. There's the 160 acres to a mean depth of 10 feet or more during the existence of the mine. But there are also thresholds for sensitive shoreline areas and non-sensitive shoreline areas. As we'll recall, in 2013, the legislature did make some changes to this category, including one, excavating for a new threshold that for excavating 20 or more acres of land to a mean depth of 10 feet or more during a mine's existence, or B, for projects that are designed to store or are capable of storing more than 7,500 tons of silica sand or have an annual throughput of more than 200,000 tons of silica sand and is not required to get a permit from the Pollution Control Agency. So these are the thresholds that currently stand for non-metallic mineral mine facilities. So let's talk a little bit about phased actions. If you're reading along, this is included in Minnesota Rules 4410-0200 subpart 60, and it identifies that phased actions are projects that meet all of the following criteria. In order for projects to be phased, they must include all these three things. They must be the same proposer, environmental effects occur in the same geographic area, and they are substantially certain to be undertaken sequentially over a limited period of time. So let's take an example. Here we have mining company X, and we have processing company X. They're the same project proposer, they're the same company. They occur in the same geographic area, they're going to happen over the same period of time. That means together they need to be reviewed for against the mandatory category threshold, and indeed they need environmental review as one environmental review for both projects. Conversely, a connected action, which again, if you're looking, it's in subpart 9C of the definitions in 0200. These connected actions can be connected if they have any of the following relationships. As compared to the project's phased actions, of course, which needed all three conditions, these can be in any of these three conditions. And these three conditions are: one directly induces the other, one is a prerequisite for the other, and the prerequisite is not justified by itself, or neither is justified by itself. In this time, we'll take that same example, except this time we'll call them different companies. But let's just say, and this is hypothetical, it's just an example, that this mine has a contract with this processing facility and they will only work together. And so without this mine, that processing facility will not have any sand to process. In this case, one induces is a prerequisite, and neither one is justified on its own. These are connected actions. But it's important to note, connected actions are uncommon. Just because these two might have a relationship does not mean that mine W has a relationship and is connected, or that processing facility Z is a connected action. So we really need that clear identification that one is inducing the other, or that neither are justified by themselves. And that's connected actions. So how does this compare to cumulative potential effects? Well, they're related, but they really are separate concepts. Of course, as we talked about, phased actions, including the 3-year look-back rule, and connected actions are determined based on how a project is defined. This happens before the environmental review is initiated, and it's compared all together. All of your phased actions and connected actions are compared against those mandatory category thresholds to see if an environmental review is required. Conversely, cumulative potential effects, those analyses are handled within the environmental assessment itself. Cumulative potential effects analyses occur as part of EAWs and EISs and should be done regardless of how big or small that project is. So this is the actual definition of cumulative potential effects. As you can see, it's way too small to read. It's a very complex definition. So let's just break it down and talk about the main ideas here. So first is that it's the combined effects of the project being proposed as well as the context of the other projects it's being proposed within. And what does that mean? That involves an environmentally relevant area. We'll get to that in just a minute. But the other thing that you need to take in mind is not just the backdrop of what's already there, but also future projects if they are planned or if there is a basis for expectation that has been laid. So the situation that might be here, and we can certainly go much deeper into this if you'd like, but in general, if there are permits that are in place and impending decisions about other projects, those are projects that may be future projects, they're not already built, but they are planned or that basis for expectation has been laid. So they would need to be considered as well. So let's talk just a little bit more about the environmentally relevant area. This refers to overlapping environmental footprints, and it is the opinion of EQB staff that this needs to be done on a case-by-case, impact-by-impact analysis. And in fact, this is why our EAW form allows for cumulative potential effects to be handled within each natural resource category or as a separate analysis done at the end of the review. Because cumulative potential effects on downstream waters could look different than air quality impacts. So, again, same little example, let's talk about how this happens for cumulative potential effects. So we've got our two little facilities. Remember, we decided they were phased. They're big enough that they need an EIS. But this RGU also has a ballpark that's been proposed. Well, this ballpark is big enough that it needs an EIS. They're not owned by the same proposer. They may or may not be in the same exact geographic area, but they've got together they have some cumulative potential effects. One example, this may not be the only one, but one example might be increased traffic. The mine, the processing facility might have increased traffic due to trucks or other types of things, and that ballpark is going to have people that want to visit the ballpark. So the increased traffic is the cumulative potential effect that needs to be considered within each of those EISs. In the mining and processing facilities EIS, they need to consider the ballpark. In the ballpark, they need to consider the background of the mine and the processing facility. Again, the cumulative potential effects, just underscoring that, occurs within that EIS process. It's not compared to a threshold. The analysis occurs during the environmental review. Okay, so those are sort of those basic concepts. Now I'd like to talk about two things that are a little bit more, we don't encounter them quite as often. And the first being the related actions EIS. Now, this is again straight out of the rule. For those of you who are reading along, it's 4410 part 2000 subpart 5. And it specifically says, and this is in the part of the rule that is titled for projects requiring an EIS. But it can be a little bit confusing because we start with an RGU may prepare a single EIS for independent projects with potential cumulative environmental impacts. It goes on, and at the bottom it says if this is more efficient than doing a separate EIS, you can do one. So there's a question here: does this apply to how does this apply with considering the backdrop of phased actions and connected actions that we have? So in some of these cases where it's not exactly explicit, we look to the SONAR for clarification. And here I wanted to extract this out. This is right from the 1988 form, so I apologize for it being a little bit difficult to read. But really the key piece is in that second sentence. In this case, the projects dealt with would be projects in geographic proximity, each which requires an EIS, but which are independent projects, i.e. not either connected or phased actions. In some cases, it may be preferable from an efficiency standpoint to cover all of the projects in one EIS. Okay, so again, we'll get back to our silly example. We've got our phased action EIS for them. Then we've got our ballpark. Well, for this RGU, they might decide that since they wisely or unwisely decided to put the mining facility and the processing facility right next to that ballpark, and we've got some potential cumulative environmental effects, we're going to do one related actions EIS because the EIS was necessary for both sets of actions. We have separate EISs. They're independent. They're not phased or connected, but they're separate EISs that the RGU, for efficiency's sake, can do as one process. Okay. And the final thing I wanted to talk about today was the environmental review variance process. This can also be a little bit confusing because as many of us who deal with regulations, we think of a variance as a variance from the authority that we have. But in this case, the variance, again, if you're reading along, is included in the prohibitions on governmental actions section. So that gives us a starting place. So let's determine what exactly is the variance from? What are we getting a variance from? In fact, the rule contains two different avenues. The first being certain governmental approvals. And what that says is that construction may begin on a project if the proposer applies for and is granted a variance, and we'll get into this a little bit later, that's in subpart 4. And that's for certain governmental approvals, not for environmental review, but for certain governmental approvals, such as permits, CUPs, IUPs, maybe air and water permits, those types of things. And then just to note, there is in subpart 9 of our rule a variance process for the for moving around environmental review itself. But as you can see, this is written with extremely strong language. It talks about the rare situation when immediate action by a governmental unit or person is essential to avoid or eliminate an imminent threat to the public health or safety. So this is a pretty high bar. And just for reference, I'm not sure, I've only had a few years, but in my tenure and in my understanding from those coming before me, this has not been applied in our EQB history. So could be a little bit wrong, but at least in our memorable history, it's not been applied. So I'm going to walk through this a little bit slowly just to make sure that we are all on the same page about what the variance actually does.
It's a little bit wrong, the same as wrong.
Maybe I could be speaking out of turn, that beyond a certain scope of time, I don't have the data to tell you certainly. Thank you for the clarification, Mr. Chair. So for the variance requirements, I think an important piece to look at here is in that second sentence. A variance may be requested at any time after the commencement of the 30-day review period following the filing of an EAW. So this would infer that the 30-day review period is that period when an EAW is on notice in the public, in the EQB monitor, has been noticed for public notice. So the variance can only be applied for after that EAW has been completed, approved by the RGU, and put on public notice. At that point, a variance for certain governmental approvals, like I said, some of those permits, could be applied for. That's how this process would work. And as you can see, this has a number of requirements to go along with the variance. Again, this happens after the EAW has already been put on public notice. And that would further go through what happens to the variance application. It gets published as well in the EQB monitor. There's opportunity for public comment. and a decision should be made by the board on the variance itself, not on the environmental review process, but on the variance itself. And then again, how is the variance granted? Again, we're looking at this rule, it's all spelled out. First of all, it's really important that the RGU be consenting to the variance. So if the RGU is not the EQB, we need to know that it's not just the project proposer seeking the variance, but that the RGU is in favor of this variance as well. And again, this is assuming that this is occurring after the EAW has already been put on notice. Again, similarly, there are a number of other requirements there. I don't know if we need to get into there, but if you have more questions, we can certainly talk more about that. And then finally, the EQB needs to put forth in writing as part of the record how the written notice or how the variance is determined, whether it's approved or not. And similarly, it's important to note this final piece that, of course, it's only those approvals that have been requested for the variance that are being given for. It's not a carte blanche approval. It's not something that that somehow negates any future decisions or environmental review in the future. It is specifically for those approvals that have been sought the variance for. And then here again, we'll just give a little bit more discussion to that emergency action. Again, this is a very high bar, very, very rarely applied, if ever, and it talks about a extremely rare situation where we have a public health or safety concern. So with that, I'll remind you once again, the question that we have today that's been brought to us is the Erickson mine, 19.11 acre mine in Houston County, a phased action of the Minnesota Sands LLC multi-site project? Now with that, I'm happy to take any questions on the actual environmental review requirements.
Questions? Thank you, Kate. You should consider being a teacher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
It's taught us a lot. Mr. Chair. Commissioner Stein.
Thank you. Kate, when the original letter was sent to Minnesota Sands and the board's decision was carried out, how was it concluded by the board and the staff at that time that the number of sites listed in the letter was the total sum of the sites that might be the subject of the EIS for Minnesota Sands? In other words, could it have been, at the time that the submittal was made by the counties asking for a redesignation of the RGU, was everything, the 9 or 11 or 10 sites, or what was how and when do we know that we know what the environmental review process is going to look at?
Okay.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Commissioner, and members of the board, I want to be careful with how I talk about our history because I wouldn't want to be in the case of doing revisionist history. I have a very good friend who's a PhD in history and she would blanch if I were to do that. So I'll be careful here. And of course we can look back into the record to get a clear understanding of what was discussed at that March 2013 meeting. That said, to give you an understanding of how the environmental review process moves forward is for an RGU to determine that a project exists. And so in this case, the project we became aware of a project, which was Minnesota Sands, and that project we knew was at least composed of the sites that were identified by these 3 counties. Of course, a full project description and the environmental review process had not moved forward yet because that would require a scoping agreement that would be signed, and that would include a project description, and that would define the complete project at that point. So in March, it was this awareness of the project, determination of the RGU for that Minnesota Sands project, but a complete project description had not yet been defined.
So, Mr. Chair, thank you, Kate. The finding we made in our findings of fact, number 27, at that March meeting says, the EQB finds that in the instances of Boyum, Dobbelstein, Kessler, Wadowitz sites in Fillmore County, and the Erickson, Tostenson, Olson, Chapel, and Johnson sites in Houston County, no EAW has been started, therefore no completed data portion of the new EAW has yet been received by an RGU, or EQB. So I too want to be cautious about revisionist history. What that statement can say, or can be read to say, is that here's a list, and in these instances, there's no data provided yet. So we're not done scoping. Is part of the message I would take from that, because there hasn't been a full description of the sites, the characteristics of the projects on those sites, and we don't have that data to rely upon. And I just wanted to point that out for board members, because what I want to be mindful of as we're thinking through this today is what is the means by which we scope a phased action EIS. Because we're being asked to make a scoping determination in part today is what I feel. So I just want to set that on the table and hear more presentation before we move forward.
Okay, thanks, John. Help me understand this a little bit better. In common farmer talk.
Do my best, sir.
So here you have this company called Minnesota Sands, right? It's an LLC, but you have, and they have several mines that are part of the LLC. And at some point, the owners of the Erickson property said, yeah, this is a great idea. We want to be part of this consortium or LLC. And then they changed their mind. Prior to any scoping document being completed, prior to any EAW being completed, what is our responsibility then from an EQB board perspective? Is it to just make the determination as to whether they should be included or not included? Isn't that what we're here to make a decision on today? And what more information does one need, given the fact that we have no scoping document, we have no information? Basically, we're here to answer the question: shall they be released from their commitment to be part of Minnesota Sands, or shall they not be released? And my sense is that we need to sort of narrow our focus, narrow the discussion on that question. And what am I missing?
Oh, Mr. Chair, members of the board, first of all, I can't presume what the relationship was or was not between any of the landowners and Minnesota Sands. That ultimately is a good question for any of those parties. I can certainly provide any answers on the rules specifically. But in terms of what our responsibility as the RGU, as I said, is to determine what the project is and determine what the complete project is and compare that against the mandatory category thresholds that we have in rule, basically to uphold the environmental review program. So if we understand that the project includes a large number of sites, then it is our responsibility to do an adequate review for that project so that better decision-making can be made. Again, remember that an environmental review is an information gathering process that should be supportive of governmental decisions. It's not indeed it's not another type of tool. It's not an enforcement tool. It's an information gathering process. So the point is to gather information on the complete project.
So what more then would the board need to make a determination as to whether they're in or out, given the fact that they said they are out? Do we need to have them say And we really mean it?
Mr. Chair.
Or where do we go from here? Commissioner?
Thank you. So, not wanting to shortcut this conversation, but I noticed that you had a few purple slips in front of you. And I wondered if anyone is here from Minnesota Sands that's willing to answer some question before the board today on, so that we could open the dialogue maybe at that point on to your question, which is, how satisfied is the board with the response?
I have no one from Minnesota Sands that's requested to testify, Commissioner, and have 4 that have, but none from the company. Commissioner Landry?
Mr. Chairman, maybe it's getting to the same question, and it may be something that we would have some information on. Do we know what the mechanism was for Erickson Mine to become part of the Minnesota Sands project? And if we do, is there an equivalent document that shows the dissolution of that?
Mr. Chair, members of the board,
Okay.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members of the board, you've received the full amount of information that the EQB staff have received. I would encourage you to speak to those parties that are here today to answer those types of questions.
So, Mr. Chair, I read the packet rather thoroughly. I saw the copy of the dissolution agreement that was signed between the Ericksons and Minnesota Sands. There was no original lease or agreement copy in those materials. So we don't know what they originally signed to enter the agreement, but we do see what they signed to exit the agreement.
Well, would anyone from Minnesota Sands care to go on the record and come up and speak to those questions? Or the Erickson or their representative would be pleased to have you come up and address these. Thank you. Kate, maybe.